Hi, again, and thanks for coming. These mornings we've been talking about, I guess, some attributes of successful lectures. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about, I guess, how we might go about organising our lectures or our courses. I'm going to kind of, I guess, focus on content and the notion that it's not necessarily always the case that more content is better. And in that context, instead of perhaps focusing on content, a lot of the literature would suggest that we'd be better off focusing on principles that underline or underpin that content. There's some nice ideas around how we can structure lectures and courses in terms of improving learning, and one of them is about revisiting ideas over time. I want to just discuss that, and the last thing is in terms of making the organisation more explicit. Sometimes some graphical tools like concept maps or mind maps or those things are really useful in terms of showing the organisation and making that kind of more explicit to students. So that's kind of where we're planning on going. In one of the earlier sessions, I talked about one of the Ken Bain's book on what great lecturers do, and the other side of that, or I guess one of the other books that I found really interesting over time is this one about how people learn. So it's looking at it from the other perspective, the learning perspective rather than the teaching one. And most of the ideas that I'm going to talk about in this session are coming from this source, I guess, or this resource. So in terms of the organisation, as I mentioned at the start, I would argue that we've kind of two very broad choices. One is about a focus on content, and one of the, I guess, arguments is that if we tend to focus on content, then often the implication is then there's going to be little depth in terms of what students might get from it. So often you'd hear people talking about that, they want to give their students a flavour of their discipline, so they're going to touch on lots of different ideas and they'll see sort of the breadth of whatever it is. And the other option in terms of organising it is to focus on helping students understand, and I think if we choose that, we don't have much option but to reduce the content, because given the types of students that we have, given the time that we have to commit to them, the kind of 13 weeks in terms of our teaching semester, we don't have a lot of time to focus on understanding. So if we choose that route, I would be saying that we need to reduce content, that it's not possible to do both things. We can't have lots of content and get students to understand that content at the same time. So broadly speaking, I would be saying that we have fundamentally we have that choice to make when we think about organising both our lectures and our course overall. And in saying that, I do recognise that there are other influences you've put in things, and that may place constraints in terms of what you can do with your courses. And obviously certain modules and things, and in some modules it's easy to change content and things like that. In others it's less easy because they might be shared across programs, or they might have ripple effects as you go up the curriculum. So it's not necessarily an easy thing to do, but I think it's certainly something that's worth thinking about. So in that kind of maybe to illustrate where I'm coming from on that, I've got a little exercise for you to try and do. I appreciate not all of you have the handout, so if you don't have the handout, you can imagine, and that will work fine too. So here we've got a map of Munster. On this map, could you indicate the location of Cork, Limerick, Waterford, and Tralee? And it's actually the second part of it that I'm more interested in. What sorts of knowledge are we using to complete this exercise? So if that's not clear to you, what I mean is, let's say one of the forms of knowledge that we could use to complete this is memorization. So by, through our secondary school or whatever, we might have memorized the locations, and therefore we can attempt to complete the exercise through memorization, for example. Right, so the second part of it is actually of more interest to me than the first part. So the types of knowledge that we're using to attempt to complete the exercise. I'm going to give you a minute, and out of curiosity, I'll have a look. So as I said, there's two things. One is pinpointing them. The other thing, as I said, is more interest is what forms of knowledge are we using in terms of completing this. And I'm going to and say, okay, here's a map of a part of northern Spain, Galicia. We've got at least four big towns in northern Spain: Coruña, Vigo, Santiago de Compostela, and Pontevedra. Could you do the same thing? Why? Well, let's go back. Let's go back to this one. What sorts of knowledge are we using to do the first exercise? Experience. So you've been to those places. Is that what you mean? Or yeah. Okay. Perfect. So we've, some of them, yes. So we've personal experience. So we're all in Cork. So hopefully we'll have a good attempt at placing Cork on the map. Right, and the likelihood is we've been to those other places. So, any other geography? Okay, and that's so. In terms of geography, how was that taught you? Rote learning. So we're going back to memorization. Right. Is there anything else we could use to try and complete this? We could use our mobile phones. It's not quite where I was going, but yeah. So one of my arguments is going to be I'm going to present two alternative ways we could address this. We could teach this topic, or we could address this topic. Obviously, I've chosen something that I think could apply to a lot of you rather than something from my own discipline, which would be much more difficult because then I'd have to do too much background explanations and stuff. But one of the limitations with memorization, so most of us would have been required to memorize these locations in geography, and that's how a lot of, let's say in secondary school, a lot of geography and history and those things would have been taught, would have been an emphasis on memorization. And one of the limitations of memorization is it doesn't transfer. So if we take a new context, we can't apply that knowledge to a new context. So it's very, very, as a mechanism for learning, it has real limitations that it's context bound. We can apply it to those examples that we're familiar with. As soon as we move outside those examples, it becomes really difficult to apply the learning that arises from memorization. And memorization is very, very strongly linked to the first option. If we choose to cover lots of topics in little depth, we're reinforcing memorization. It's memorization techniques that are primarily going to be used. And that's one of the big limitations about having curricula that have tons and tons of content, is the ways in which we can apply it subsequently are very limited. If we focus on content and lots of content, the sort of literature on learning would suggest that, if we imagine a mental map of how that information is stored, it's stored as discrete components. So we've, Cork is here, Tralee over here, whatever it is. And there's very few links between those ideas, right? And again, what the literature on learning would suggest is that the more links we have between ideas, the easier it is to remember them. There's more routes to accessing that information. So one of the recommendations is in terms of, I guess, improving learning and memory and those types of things. So we should focus on principles in one case, or in one instance, and also trying to reinforce links between ideas. And I'm going to give an example of how we might do that in a minute. So the literature would suggest if we, as I said, if we focus on lots of topics, it's more difficult. The literature on learning talks about encoding the information. That's basically getting it into our heads, so it's more difficult to do that. Okay, students struggle more with that. It's less likely to be integrated with things that students already know, so it sits there as discrete pieces. There's fewer links, which makes it harder to remember. Relationships are not evident. It also, studies would show that it takes longer to actually retrieve the information. So because these are disconnected and separate, we have to access 4 different, if you like, pieces of memory in order to complete this exercise, and that takes more time than if we can connect those together in some way, and therefore we're really only accessing like one area in our brain. So the literature would suggest, that, go back here, that it takes longer to retrieve the information, and it requires more effort to retrieve the information. And again, that's important, that this notion that if we can make it easier and less effort to retrieve it, then when we're given problems, we can focus on the problems rather than on trying to retrieve information. So it simplifies the processing that's required in our heads. And as I said, one of the big issues is this notion of transfer, that it doesn't happen. So if I just slip back 2 slides, the other, I guess, here, the other way in which we can go about organizing our learning is to focus on principles, right? So if we decided to focus on principles, then in terms of this context, this geography sort of context, one of the principles would be around the notion of urbanization. Put context to that. So let's say we have a historical context. In the historical context, those towns arose because they had very good trade routes. Okay? They're located, and trade in that context, in that time, was primarily through boats. So therefore, you have the locations of those towns are beside the sea because we have easy access to them from other countries, and typically on the mouths of rivers, so that you could then distribute goods inland very easily. So instead of asking students to memorize these 4 bits of pieces, if we look at the principles, or some of the principles around it, which is, in this case, for example, the historical context, the notion of trade is one of the primary reasons why these towns arose. Then what we have is a mechanism for organizing that knowledge, and once we have a mechanism for organizing that knowledge, it becomes much easier to learn the material, you're more likely to retain the material, and it's much easier to use the material. So all of the literature would say that it would suggest that if we want to help students learn, if we want to be effective in that way, then the thing that we need to focus on is not the surface features of our disciplines, but the principles that underline them. And if we can make those explicit to our students, then we're going to make their job as learners much, much easier. And I guess what we're also doing in this, is modeling how the discipline thinks. So geographers, whatever the term might be for them, don't memorize information. They think about the reasons why those things are the way they are. So the reasons why towns have developed. The historical context is only one example. There are lots of other things which could be social context, political context. So we've got a series of ideas which have dictated why and where those towns have arisen. And as I said, if we were to organize, if we were to teach this topic, rather than focusing on memorization, if we focus on the principles, then if I go back to my second example, then one of the strengths of this is we can then apply that knowledge to new contexts. Right? So if I was applying that to this context, I would be saying, okay, so we're looking for The likelihood is that some of these towns are going to be beside the sea, and the likelihood is that they're going to be on rivers, right? Because we need trade inland. So now I can start to say, well, there's a really good chance there's a big town up here. Look, we've got a really nice safe harbour. Come down along here, there's a possibility here. Then we've got a nice big safe harbour here. There's a good chance there's something here, possibly down here, and possibly down here. Right? We can apply knowledge to new contexts if we understand the principles behind the idea, or the principles behind the content or the learning. And as I said, if we focus on that notion both in our lectures and in terms of the topic overall, there's a much better likelihood that the information gets into people's brains in the first place. Right? It's more likely to be integrated. One of the things that we can see here is we start focusing then on some of the relationships between the ideas. So in which ways, like trade might have more influences. There's also social context to that. You have employment, you have protection, and you're looking at the relationship between those concepts as well as the concept itself. It becomes easier to remember because we have more roots to that information. It's faster to access it, it requires less effort, and it's easier to apply, and it's more likely to support transfer. Right? And this would be, again, the argument around using principles or focusing on principles rather than necessarily focusing on content. Does anyone have any thoughts, objections even? Yeah, shoot.
It just strikes me like what you're essentially saying is that principles alone you have a better guess.
No, well, yes, it's certainly more informed.
But it depends on the context. Because we could take, let's say, for instance, an important city like Paris, which is near the coast.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that.
No, but just using the example.
Yeah, but I'm not suggesting that this is the only reason why towns have arisen. So there are political contexts, there are social contexts. So if you understand that, and I'm not a geography expert, so I don't understand all of the reasons, but if you understand that, you will be better able to apply that knowledge to new contexts because those principles don't change. So like the reason why you have why towns, for example, why you have major organizations in Spain is going to be the same reason why you have major organizations in the UK or in any other country.
Yes, so therefore it's always context sensitive, so we have to understand the environment because what might be good practice in one place is not necessarily. Not a few.
I wouldn't think so. My understanding is that if you focus on principles, they don't tend to change. Or if it is very context bound, then your teaching would be looking at the way that they change in different contexts.
But then you have to be aware of the context, which
absolutely.
So then there's another load in order to actually.
Yes.
Like principles are based on what you call it a body of knowledge which has probably evolved over quite a period of time.
Yeah.
And I accept that the principles are very, very handy because instead of dragging a big toolbox around, you little satchel with all of your principles and say, well, I can apply these. But in order to apply them and to apply them in a meaningful sense, then one would imagine that the individual who is applying these actually has access to this big body of knowledge from which he can draw.
Yeah.
And the question is, for me, like, where do they get the big body of knowledge?
From you.
Because that's going to take time.
Yeah, and that's my argument, is that, like, if we choose to go down this, or I'll go the other way. If we choose to focus on lots of topics, you cannot do this. I'm not arguing that it's easy to do or that it's fast to do. It's not. And all the literature would suggest that it takes a lot of time for students to understand concepts. Much more time to understand concepts than to do the surface type of thing. So if we were to go about an organization or try and organize lectures or courses based on understanding, we're looking at major features or principles of our subject and trying to identify those. And obviously one of the difficulties here is that not necessarily the major features or principles are unanimously agreed. So there's a selection process there in terms of, or there can be I guess, a discussion or dispute around what the major features or principles are. We need to think about how students initially understand the subject and whether, they have a valid understanding of it. So, as a little example of that, again from the book, here's from primary school, when children are first introduced to the notion that the Earth is a sphere, which stands in contrast to their physical understanding of the Earth, which is that it's flat. So our kids have a preconception that the world is flat, and then they're told that actually, hey, that's not true at all. You're standing on a ball. So as an example of misconceptions and preconceptions, there's a study done that looked at children's physics and loads of things. And so children were asked, after being instructed about the world is round, children were asked to draw an image of themselves standing on the world, okay, or on the Earth. So here's, a number of them had the correct conception. Look, here's the Earth is here, or the Earth is here, and here's me sitting on it. And then lots of others had slightly misconstrued, but it's close enough. And here then we've got kids, and here again, who are trying to reconcile how they know, how they've experienced the Earth with what they've been told. And some of them have two images. This is how I actually know it, this is what I've been told. So if I'm asked an exam question, this is what I'm going to return with. But fundamentally, I know this is the truth. So they haven't, because of the teaching hasn't, maybe addressed these misconceptions. And here again, with this dual notion, look, round, but actually it's flat. So here's me standing inside in this fishbowl and stuff. So one of the things, once we start going with principles, and particularly if they're things that students have experienced, so physics would be a typical example. They've experienced motion and force and different things, and they don't fully understand those things. They understand them in the way they've experienced them, which is not necessarily how they work. And therefore, it's quite likely when we teach them, if we don't go back to that initial understanding and address any misconceptions that are there, they carry through those misconceptions. So they carry through how they experience it, and when we ask them to apply that learning to new contexts, to real-world problems, this is the understanding they apply and not what they've been taught. So again, this notion of, I guess, misconceptions or preconceptions is something that's important. And again, it takes time to address these things. You mentioned, John, about context. If we want to understand principles, we do need to look at different contexts and how they vary or how they apply to different contexts. And we need to be structuring activities so that learners can retrieve and apply. And there is a balance, I think, between developing understanding and gaining fluency. And I think one of the things that perhaps we don't focus on very much is fluency. And certainly in lots of topics, maybe in other areas that there is an emphasis on fluency. But certainly in some topics it's about, knowing it rather than being very good at it or being quite good at it. And that kind of implication. So, one of the subjects that I teach is quite mathematical. It involves lots of fractions and stuff like that. This is in fourth year. My students are, by and large, are not fluent with fractions. So when we're doing operations with them, we'll be doing with fractions when they're manipulating them. And the implication of that is they are so focused on, do I cross-multiply or multiply the tops and the bottoms, or what do I do, that they're not focusing on the concepts. Okay, so for me, it's just a routine. It's just a method that they need to do. And what I really want them to be thinking about is why we're doing this. What's the ideas behind this? But they're losing that because they're focusing so much on the actual manipulation. And, geez, Tom, why is it that way and not? And you're going back and you're addressing. And it's because they're not fluent with these things. And that can have huge implications in terms of their learning. So there are certain things, I would argue, that they should be fluent with, or that they need to be fluent with, if they are, to be able to understand concepts easily. And that's an issue because, as I said, particularly if we have lots of content, we don't have time for fluency. Fluency requires lots of time, lots of examples, lots of practice, and there are implications.
And Tom, just a question.
Absolutely.
As a student in fourth year, which is, with still a little bit of misunderstanding or lack of confidence, would it require, like just as you said, it required lots of maybe kind of one-to-one teaching to be able to, regain that confidence in them, as opposed to the usual environment, which is the number of students and, you have to go through the material relatively quickly. Because I suppose if they don't get that in the early years, usual, what we're always talking about in primary school or secondary school, then, it requires a considerable amount of work. If they want to go into engineering or subjects that require mathematical ability, and they don't understand the basic concepts.
They don't.
So they need that.
And
more effort.
Yes, it is, and it does. There are, as I said, there are implications. So, for me, I guess you have two choices. You can either try and address that lack of understanding, or I have to change the way that I teach it so that there's less focus on that mathematics, and I'm shifting away from the mathematics because they find that really difficult, and finding alternative ways in which I can explain it but doesn't require, the same. So I guess you have two options in terms of trying to address that, and it's about whatever is likely to work best. I'm gonna finish up very quickly. One of the ideas in terms of lectures that we know again that works quite well is if we have a number of concepts. Often we teach them in blocks, so we'll take concept A and go, I'm going to spend 3 weeks looking at concept A, 3 weeks looking at concept B, and 3 weeks looking at concept B. The literature would suggest actually we're much better off to split those up and revisit them over time. So for example, here I'm taking concept 1, we're looking at the teachers' and students' view of some, or two different perspectives of the concept. If we split that up and look at, for example, concept 1, 2, and 3 from one perspective, and then come back and revisit them again from a different perspective, the literature would suggest that students find it much easier to remember the information, to use the information, and to apply the information. So when we're structuring our courses, if we can think of the ways in which we can maybe revisit topics either over time, okay, rather than just teaching a block and forgetting about it and moving on to the next block. So we might teach a component of it and then like 3 or 4 weeks later come back to it and maybe elaborate on it or look at it from a different perspective. That is a really powerful tool in terms of improving understanding and retaining information, to come back and revisit ideas. And again, my argument, this obviously takes time, and you can't do that if we have lots of content. So to finish up, we talked about some of we just very briefly talked in this notion of repeating concepts over time. I have a diagram here which, again, a lot of the literature would suggest if we can create kind of either concept maps or something like that, or mind maps, or encourage students to create them. So sometimes at the end of class, if we have time, or if I've planned for it, what I'd ask students is to create sort of blanks or notes. What were the kind of important ideas around concepts that improve learning? And we're asking students to fill in that, so it would be about the notion that it helps transfer, it helps memory, it helps to apply the ideas and stuff like that. And presenting information in different ways. So we have our information maybe textually and then graphically, helps again to get it into people's brains. We have two different views of the same thing, so they're more likely to get it in to their brain, they're more likely to store it, and they're more likely to be able to use it if we look at alternative ways of presenting the information as well. So the same idea but presented in different ways is something that we know helps students. I'm very conscious of time. I'm very conscious that lots of you have classes. If you have classes, please feel free to run. If you have questions at any time on any of this, please feel free to send me an email. And again, thank you so much for your time and for turning up here this morning.